Under the frozen winter sky, a weathered dog lifted his head toward the full moon and howled a sound that broke through the silence of the world, as if mourning a promise finally fulfilled. Beneath the ancient oak tree where secrets once slept, the truth had been unearthed, and justice had finally found its way home. He had waited so long for this moment, fought so hard without ever speaking a word, and when the last lie crumbled, he sang his goodbye to the only man who had ever understood him. This is not just a story about betrayal and vengeance. It is a story about loyalty that outlives death, about a bond that even the coldest winter could not silence. If this journey touches your heart, if somewhere deep inside you believe that some promises are too sacred to be broken, I invite you to stay, like this story if it found a place inside you. Subscribe if you believe in the kind of loyalty that never dies, and leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from and which moment stayed with you long after the last note of that final howl. The rain fell in a soft, mournful drizzle, soaking the stone paths of the Greenwood Cemetery and blurring the silhouettes of the gathered mourners. A dull hum filled the air, the sound of grief too heavy to speak, too raw to name. Beneath the shelter of a worn-out black umbrella, a small group of people clustered together, their faces shadowed, their bodies trembling against the damp chill. In the center of the procession stood an oak coffin, polished to a shine that seemed almost obscene under the grim sky. Atop it lay a folded American flag, the colors muted by the grayness of the day. A camera perched discreetly in the corner, red light blinking, recording every second for a family too broken to fully absorb this moment. At the foot of the coffin sat a German shepherd, majestic, unmoving, and soaked to the bone. A shadow. His fur, once thick and proud, now clung to his lean frame. His dark eyes refused to blink, refused to waver, locked in a stare so intense that even the living hesitated to step too close. People whispered about the loyalty of dogs, about grief, about how Shadow must not understand that his master Elijah Brooks wasn't coming back. But there was something else in Shadow's stance, something far colder than simple mourning. It was Detective Michael Hayes who first noticed it. Standing near the back with his hands jammed into the pockets of his trench coat, he watched, frowning, as Shadow's gaze never once touched the coffin, never once drifted to the sobbing mother or the weeping friends. Instead, the dog's head tilted ever so slightly, fixating on a spot just to the left of the casket. But Michael couldn't let it go. His gut twisted in that familiar way that had saved him more times than he could count during his 20 years on the force. Something was wrong. The priest's voice quavered as he read from the Book of Psalms, the words flat and hollow against the weight of the moment. A gust of wind howled through the cemetery, snapping the edges of the tent, and a few mourners ducked instinctively. Shadow didn't flinch. Instead, a low, almost inaudible growl rumbled from deep within his chest, a warning primal and raw. Behind the camera, a young assistant adjusted the zoom, trying to frame a tighter shot of the dog and coffin for the video. As the lens tightened, the image sharpened. Shadow, muscles taut, fur bristling, eyes burning with a fierce, almost desperate energy, stared at nothing. Nothing visible, at least. Michael narrowed his eyes. In the zoomed feed displayed on the small monitor, a strange shimmer seemed to ripple through the air where Shadow's gaze was fixed. A trick of the light, surely, the mind playing games under stress. But deep inside, Michael knew better. The eulogy droned on. Stories about Elijah's bravery, his relentless pursuit of justice, his kindness, his loyalty. None of them mentioned the last 6 months, the months when Elijah had seemed haunted, paranoid, insisting someone was following him, insisting he had uncovered something he shouldn't have. Those stories had been buried along with his reputation. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing down on the mourners. A few began to shift uncomfortably, stealing glances at Shadow. It wasn't just sadness anymore. It was unease. A child whimpered. A woman stifled a cry. Still, Shadow did not move. His body's a live wire of tension, his eyes never leaving that silent, empty space. The camera caught all the dog's snarl that seemed to rise with the cadence of the priest's final words. The tremor in his paws, the way he strained forward, as if ready to leap at whatever it was he saw or thought he saw. Then, without warning, Shadow let out a sharp, piercing bark that cracked across the cemetery like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The priest stumbled over his words. Two men lunged forward to restrain the dog. But Shadow held his ground, his body rigid, his teeth bared. One of the men, Officer Daniels, reached for Shadow's collar, but the moment his hand brushed the fur, he recoiled as if burned. "Jesus," he muttered, shaking his hand. "He's ice cold." Michael pushed forward, adrenaline flaring. "Let him be," he barked, and though he didn't know why, he knew in his bones that restraining Shadow now would be a mistake. Instead, he watched, and the camera watched, and everyone else, frozen between reverence and terror, watched as Shadow took 3 deliberate steps toward the empty space beside the coffin. He sat down, raised his head, and minutes dragged into lifetimes. Then the ceremony resumed, awkward, broken. As the final prayer was whispered and the coffin was lowered into the earth, Shadow remained unmoving, eyes locked on the invisible specter only he could see. Hours later, when the crowd had dispersed and the rain had finally given way to the reluctant light of late afternoon, the cemetery was quiet once more. Only the soft whirring of the camera remained, still recording. And Shadow, still there, still watching, as if waiting for something, or someone. Later that evening, after the rain had ceased and the last of the mourners had faded into the mist, Detective Michael Hayes found himself seated in the dimly lit back room of the funeral home. His coat still damp from the day's deluge, the faint smell of wet earth clinging to him like a memory. A small group had gathered around the playback monitor. The funeral director, the camera operator, and 2 young assistants who looked as if they would have rather been anywhere else. The atmosphere was heavy, not with grief this time, but with something more electric, more tangible. Suspicion. Michael leaned forward, elbows on his knees, as the camera operator, a wiry man named Joel with shaking hands, queued up the footage. Don't touch anything," Joel stammered, glancing around nervously. "It was recording straight through, no edits, no glitches. I swear." Michael simply nodded, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the screen. The video began. The familiar scene unfolding in muted tones, the mourners gathered under the sagging tent, the priest murmuring prayers into the cold, wet air, the coffin gleaming under the diffuse gray light. And Shadow, always Shadow, still and tense, his gaze unwavering. Everything seemed normal, heartbreakingly normal, until precisely 36 minutes and 12 seconds into the footage. The screen flickered, a sharp crackle of static slicing across the image, distorting the mourners into grotesque, melting figures for exactly 3 seconds. Michael's heart pounded in his ears as he leaned closer. Amidst the flickering chaos, something or someone materialized beside the coffin. A tall figure, shrouded in what seemed like mist, stood utterly still, one hand resting lightly on Shadow's broad shoulder. The German Shepherd did not flinch. He did not move. He simply accepted the touch as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The distortion ended as abruptly as it had begun, the image snapping back to the somber scene of the funeral. The phantom gone as if it had never been there, but Michael had seen it, and so had everyone else in the room. A strangled gasp broke the silence. Joel scrubbed a trembling hand over his mouth. "You was standing there," he whispered hoarsely. "I swear on my life, I was filming the whole time. There wasn't anyone near that coffin except the dog." Michael said nothing, letting the weight of the revelation settle into the bones of the room. The funeral director turned pale, mumbling something about optical illusions, grief-induced hallucinations, tricks of the light. But Michael knew better. He replayed the clip again, frame by frame, his heart hammering as the figure flickered into existence and out again. It wasn't just a shadow or a smear on the lens. It was detailed, distinct, and more chilling than anything, it was purposeful. The hand on Shadow's shoulder wasn't casual. It was intimate, familiar, like the touch of a loved one saying a final goodbye. Michael sat back, running a hand over his face. There was more. He could feel it. "Play it again," he ordered. Joel hesitated but obeyed, scrubbing the footage back and hitting play. This time, Michael kept his eyes not on the figure, but on Shadow. As the distortion surged and the phantom appeared, Shadow's collar, a thick leather band worn smooth with time, twitched. Not from the wind, not from movement. It twitched as if an invisible hand had stroked down his neck, the way Elijah used to. Michael's breath caught. "Stop," he said sharply. Joel froze the frame. They all stared, Shadow's body tense and braced, his ears pinned slightly back, his collar trembling subtly against his silky fur. Not from fear, not from rage, from recognition. Michael stood slowly, his joints popping, and crossed to the monitor, pointing at the frozen image. "Zoom in," he said. Joel fumbled with the controls, but the image magnified. Grainy but clear enough. There was a slight indentation on Shadow's fur, just beneath the collar, as if unseen fingers had pressed there. Joel's three-finger system stepping back. Michael didn't move. His mind raced, spinning webs of possibilities he hated even to consider. If Elijah's spirit, if whatever remained of him was still tethered to this world, then this was not a simple case of grief. It was a warning. Or a plea. Joel shakily clicked through a few more minutes of footage. Every time the camera panned over Shadow, the same phenomenon repeated. A faint shimmering, a tremor in the air, a nearly imperceptible ripple, as if the fabric between this world and the next had worn thin. And always Shadow's unwavering gaze fixed on that empty space by the coffin. Michael pressed two fingers against his temple, feeling a headache build behind his eyes. Logic warred with instinct. His badge told him to find the rational explanation, the science, the trick of the light. His gut told him otherwise. Outside the window, the night deepened, the mist crawling back over the cemetery grounds like ghostly fingers. The funeral director muttered excuses and left the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, leaving only Michael, Joel, and the two wide-eyed assistants. The room seemed smaller now, the air colder. Joel's voice broke the silence. What do we do?" Michael didn't answer right away. He watched the frozen image of Shadow, the phantom, the coffin. His chest tightened. Elijah had been trying to tell him something before he died, trying and failing. But maybe now, through the loyalty of a creature that saw beyond the veil, Elijah was still trying. Michael exhaled slowly, the decision hardening in his bones. "We find out," he said finally, his voice low but sure. "We find out what he's trying to say." A sudden creak sounded from the hallway, soft but unmistakable. All four men stiffened, staring at the doorway. There was no one, only shadows. The shadows in the funeral home clung to the corners like silent witnesses as Michael Hayes walked out into the cold night air, his mind racing. He could still feel the eyes from the frozen video frame burning into him, could still sense the ghostly ripple in the footage. Something had stirred that afternoon, something that refused to be buried with Elijah Brooks. And Michael was beginning to realize that the truth demanded more than silent mourning. It demanded action. He drove through the deserted streets with the heater blasting, the city flashing past in gray, wet blurs. His destination was clear: the old evidence locker housed in the basement of the 9th Precinct, where Elijah's personal effects had been unceremoniously stored after the so-called internal investigation that had ended his career and, Michael suspected, his life. He flashed his badge to the bored night clerk, who barely looked up from his phone, and descended into the bowels of the station. The concrete walls sweating moisture, the flickering fluorescent lights buzzing like trapped insects. The locker was a grim archive of broken careers and buried scandals, a place where the department kept its shame tucked away from public view. Elijah's box was shoved into a corner, dusty and dented, the label half peeled away. Michael dragged it onto a metal table, his fingers trembling slightly as he pried it open. Inside were the pathetic remnants of a life dismantled. A cracked badge, a torn uniform patch, a few tattered notebooks, a leather collar the twin of the one still worn by Shadow, and a sealed evidence bag containing a slim manila folder. Michael opened the notebooks first. They were filled with Elijah's precise handwriting, detailed accounts of stakeouts, notes on suspects, observations about the increasing tension within the department. But there was something else too. Pages toward the back filled with frantic, almost desperate scribbles, the same phrase repeated again and again in jagged script. He watches, he waits. Beneath the notebooks, tucked into a worn envelope, was a sheaf of photocopies stamped confidential, internal use only. Elijah had submitted multiple incident reports over the last 8 months of his career, each more urgent than the last, warning that he believed he was being followed, surveilled, targeted. He described late-night footsteps outside his apartment, his tires slashed twice in the department lot, anonymous threats left on his windshield. In his final report, dated just 2 weeks before his dismissal. Elijah named a tall male, light-build, unconfirmed ID, possibly affiliated with Internal Affairs, as the source of the harassment. The reports were thorough, measured, backed by evidence, but each one had been stamped with a curt notation: no. Michael's hands clenched into fists. Someone had seen the danger Elijah was in and had deliberately buried it. He dug deeper into the box, driven by a compulsion he barely understood, until his fingers brushed against something brittle and dry, a crumpled piece of lined paper tucked between the folds of the leather collar. He unfolded it carefully, heart pounding. It was a letter, written in Elijah's unmistakable hand, the lines shaky, smudged as if penned in haste or fear. Michael read it under the flickering lights, the words etching themselves into his bones. "If you are reading this, I am either missing or dead. They will say it was an accident, a fall, a fight gone wrong, maybe even suicide. Do not believe them. I have seen too much. I know too much. They cannot let me leave." Michael sat back, the letter trembling in his grip. He thought of Elijah, proud, infuriatingly honest Elijah, reduced to hiding desperate pleas among his belongings, knowing that even in death, his truth might never surface. A deep, guttural rage surged through Michael, a fury not only at the injustice but at himself for not seeing it sooner, for letting the machinery of the department grind Elijah under without raising his voice in protest. He stuffed the notebooks, the letter, and the evidence folder into his satchel and slammed the locker shut, the metallic clang echoing down the empty hallway. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye, a dark shape moving at the edge of his vision. He spun around, heart hammering, but there was nothing there. Only the empty corridor, the flickering lights, and the soft, almost imperceptible sound of a door slowly creaking open somewhere deep in the station. Michael didn't wait to investigate. He needed to get out, needed to breathe, needed to piece together what he had just found. Outside, the night had deepened, the mist coiling around the street lamps like ghostly fingers. He climbed into his car, locked the doors, and pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name he was looking for: Jasmine Brooks, Elijah's sister. He hesitated only a moment before dialing. It rang twice before she picked up, her voice groggy but immediately alert. "Detective Hayes, Miss Brooks," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We need to talk about Elijah." There was a pause, a sharp intake of breath. "Is this about the funeral?" she asked. "Or about the other thing?" Michael gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Both," he said grimly. "And I think it's a lot worse than either of us imagined." The silence stretched between them, heavy and brimming with dread. Then quietly she said, "Meet me at Elijah's old place, midnight." Michael agreed and hung up, his reflection staring back at him from the dark screen, his face pale, haunted. He started the car, the engine rumbling to life beneath him, and pulled away from the curb, unaware of the shadowy figure that watched him from across the street. Unseen, unmoving, patient. The clock in Elijah's old townhouse ticked with an unnerving slowness, each second stretching into a small eternity as Michael stepped through the front door just minutes before midnight. Jasmine was already inside, standing stiffly in the narrow hallway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if warding off an invisible chill. Shadow lay sprawled at the threshold of Elijah's old bedroom, his head resting on his paws, his ears flicking at every tiny creak the house made. Michael immediately noticed how different the dog seemed now gone. Was the proud, poised canine he'd remembered from the funeral. In its place was a creature wound tight with a feral tension, his muscles rigid, his breathing shallow. Michael greeted Jasmine with a nod, setting his satchel down by the door. "How long has he been like this?" he asked quietly, his voice sounding too loud in the heavy air. Jasmine swallowed. "Since the funeral. He won't leave that spot. Won't eat much, won't sleep, just stares at nothing." Michael looked closer, following the line of Shadow's unwavering gaze. The hallway stretched out in front of him, ending in a darkened alcove. The shadows seemed thicker there, heavier, almost vibrating. Michael frowned, an uneasy sensation crawling along his spine. "I set up a camera," Jasmine said, moving to a laptop perched on the kitchen counter. "Didn't know what else to do. I thought maybe—" She trailed off. Michael joined her, peering over her shoulder as she pulled up the footage. The video was grainy, lit only by the faint glow of a nightlight near the staircase. But it was enough to make out Shadow's rigid form, stationed at the bedroom door, just as he was now. For hours, he didn't move, only his ears twitching occasionally. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m., the feed distorted briefly and Michael's heart stopped. A dark smear, elongated and slow-moving, drifted across the hallway behind Shadow. Not a shadow cast by someone walking by, not a trick of the light. It was something tangible, something that moved with eerie deliberateness, gliding through the air like a living thing. The shadow lifted his head as the shape passed, a low, guttural growl rumbling from deep within his chest. His body tense but not attacking, recognizing. Michael leaned closer, rewinding and playing the clip again and again, each time feeling the prickle of dread crawl deeper under his skin. "You see it, don't you?" Jasmine whispered. Michael nodded, his mouth dry. "Yeah," he said hoarsely. They watched in silence as the dark smear faded into the shadows near the stairwell, leaving Shadow staring after it with haunted eyes. Jasmine clicked to the next video file, recorded the following night. It was worse. At 3:06 a.m., Shadow suddenly sprang to his feet, barking furiously into the darkness. His body language was aggressive, defensive, but what chilled Michael to the bone was the way the environment responded. On screen, the digital thermometer mounted near the stairwell visibly plummeted. In less than 2 seconds, the temperature dropped from a stable 68 degrees to a freezing 42. Jasmine had installed the device after Elijah's strange complaints about cold spots in the house, complaints no one had taken seriously. Until now. "He feels it," Jasmine said, her voice trembling. "Every night he feels it before it happens." Michael watched as Shadow lunged at something invisible, his teeth snapping at empty air, his barks frantic, feral. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, Shadow collapsed onto his haunches, whining low in his throat, his head bowed, his tail tucked tightly against his body. "Surrender." Michael pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead, trying to push away the flood of images assaulting his brain. The distorted video at the funeral, the desperate scrawlings in Elijah's notebooks, the unseen figure resting a hand on Shadow's shoulder. "Something's here," he said finally, his voice barely more than a breath. "And it's not finished." Jasmine closed the laptop with a trembling hand. We do?" she asked, tears brimming in her eyes. Michael didn't answer immediately. He crossed back to the hallway, standing just behind Shadow, staring into the gloom. The air felt heavy, pressing down on his chest. A faint static crackled against his skin, raising goosebumps along his arms. Shadow suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked, muscles coiling as he focused on a point near the alcove. Michael followed the dog's gaze, heart hammering. For a moment, just a fraction of a heartbeat, he thought he saw it too. A ripple in the darkness, a figure-shaped distortion shifting against the far wall. He blinked and it was gone, leaving only the oppressive silence and the faint sound of Shadow's ragged breathing. Michael crouched down beside the dog, resting a hand lightly on his fur. Shadow didn't flinch, but remained locked on that invisible threat. Every fiber of his being braced against it. Michael whispered almost to himself, "He's still protecting him even now." The realization hit like a blow. Shadow wasn't just mourning. He was guarding Elijah's last secret, standing vigil against whatever had come for his master and maybe, just maybe, whatever had killed him. The old wood of the house groaned under its own weight, the pipes rattling in the walls, but neither man nor dog moved. Somewhere deep within the house, a door creaked open, slow and deliberate, the sound cutting through the thick air like a knife. Shadow growled low and deep, the sound vibrating through Michael's bones. He rose slowly to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for the pistol tucked under his coat. Jasmine stood frozen by the kitchen, her eyes wide with terror. Another creak, another groan, something moving, something unseen. The night pressed down on Michael as he sat alone in his apartment, the flicker of the laptop screen casting long, restless shadows across the walls. Shadow lay curled at his feet, breathing shallowly, his ears twitching now and then as if still hearing things no human could. Michael knew sleep was a lost cause tonight. His mind churned with the images from the funeral, the security footage from Elijah's house, and the relentless certainty that the answers he needed would not come from the living. He cracked open another beer, ignoring the growing stack of empty bottles by his side, and logged into the precinct's classified database using credentials he was no longer authorized to access. It was a risk, a massive one, but Michael didn't care anymore. Elijah deserved better than a lie etched onto a headstone. The case file on Elijah Brooks had been sealed tighter than most homicide investigations, buried under bureaucratic jargon and redacted statements. Michael worked methodically, pulling apart layers of clearance protocols, piecing together scraps of data that someone clearly didn't want found. The initial autopsy report was the first red flag. It stated Elijah had died from blunt force trauma consistent with a fall down a flight of stairs. Accidental, open and shut. But Michael had known Elijah knew the man's instincts, his agility, his strength. Elijah wouldn't have simply fallen. He dug deeper, cross-referencing the report with standard procedure manuals. And that's when the discrepancies surfaced like bodies in a stagnant pond. The official medical examiner's signature had been digitally inserted onto the report, 3 days after the documented date of death. Forensics photographs were missing from the evidence log. And strangest of all, a second, preliminary autopsy had been conducted the night of Elijah's death. An autopsy that told a much darker story. Michael leaned in closer, the glow of the screen painting harsh angles across his face. The preliminary findings noted severe contusions across Elijah's torso and arms, defensive wounds consistent with a struggle, bruising on the wrists as if from restraints, and fractures that suggested repeated blunt force trauma not from a fall but from deliberate violence. His blood chilled. Someone had beaten Elijah before he died and then buried the truth under layers of falsified paperwork. Michael exhaled shakily, his hands clenching into fists on the tabletop. Who had that much power? Who had that much to hide? He pulled up the names of the officers who had processed the scene, documented the evidence, and testified in the internal investigation. A list of 8 men and women appeared on the screen. Michael recognized some of the names of good cops, or at least they had been. But as he scanned further, a knot twisted in his gut. Of the 8, 5 were now deceased, 2 missing under unusual circumstances, and the last, Sergeant Dylan Marks, had retired abruptly and vanished into obscurity. Michael clicked on the first name, Officer Reyes. Dead 6 months ago, apparent suicide. Left behind a cryptic note saying only, "It's still watch." Ex-Detective Owens. Fatal car crash, though friends reported he had been increasingly paranoid in the days before his death, claiming to see shadows in the corners of his home. Officer Phelps. Missing, presumed dead, last seen rambling incoherently about being followed by something that wasn't human. Each case spiraled into the next, a chain of fear and death stretching back to the night Elijah died. Michael's skin crawled as realization dawned. These weren't coincidences. These weren't random tragedies. Something or someone was systematically erasing everyone who knew the truth. He pushed away from the table, pacing the room with sharp, restless steps. Shadow lifted his head, ears pinned back, fencing his master's agitation. Michael grabbed his phone and called an old contact in internal affairs, a woman named Erica Langley who owed him more favors than she liked to admit. The line buzzed twice before she answered, her voice clipped and wary. "Hayes, it's been a while. I need a favor," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "Off the record. I need access to the IA files on the Elijah Brooks investigation. The real ones, not the sanitized crap they fed to the press." A long pause. "Michael," she said slowly, "you don't want to dig there. I've seen the reports. Half the people tied to that mess are dead. And before they died, every single one of them said the same thing." "A shadow," Michael finished for her, his voice grim. "Yeah," Erica whispered. "A shadow that never left them alone." Michael closed his eyes, gripping the phone tighter. "Please, Erica, I need those files." Another hesitation, then a resigned sigh. "I'll send you what I have, but be careful, Mike. Some things are better left buried." The line went dead. Within minutes, an encrypted email pinged into Michael's inbox, containing redacted IA transcripts and confidential witness testimonies. He opened them hungrily, scanning page after page of suppressed statements, hidden evidence, ignored pleas for protection. Patterns emerged, Elijah had been on the verge of exposing something big: corruption that stretched high into the department's upper echelons. His death had been orchestrated to look like an accident. And now, whatever darkness had claimed him was hunting down everyone connected to the cover-up. Michael leaned back in his chair, scrubbing a hand down his face. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than he'd imagined. Elijah hadn't just been murdered, he had been silenced. And the thing haunting them all, the thing trailing after the living, wasn't finished. Shadow whined low in his throat, his body tense, his gaze fixed once again on an empty corner of the room where the shadows seemed thicker, almost pulsing with life. Michael turned slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. For a split second, he thought he saw it, a sliver of movement, darker than the darkness itself. Watching, waiting, his pulse roared in his ears. Somewhere deep inside, he knew that whatever he had stirred awake by reopening this investigation. The night stretched endlessly around Michael as he sat hunched over his desk. The pale blue glow of his laptop screen the only illumination in the darkened room. Every so often glancing nervously toward the corners where the darkness seemed too deep, too alive, and where Shadow, lying rigidly at his feet, would occasionally growl low and warningly, his hackles bristling with primal instinct. But Michael forced himself to focus, forced his trembling fingers to click through the files Erica had sent, knowing that whatever nightmare he had stepped into, Elijah had stepped into it first, and he had done so alone. The deeper Michael dug, the more monstrous the reality became, peeling away the layers of deception to reveal a conspiracy so vile it twisted his stomach into knots. Elijah had been investigating a human trafficking ring, children, women exploited and discarded, and at the rotten core of it all stood the one man Michael had once trusted without question, Chief Leonard Prescott, the polished, revered leader of the city's police force, a man whose public persona of righteousness concealed a festering rot. Michael's hands shook as he read Elijah's coded notes. Records of stakeouts, photographs taken from afar, copies of financial ledgers that traced dirty money from the chief's charitable foundations straight into the black markets, and most chillingly, a half-finished dossier titled simply Opus. The name meant nothing to Michael at first, but as he cross-referenced it with seized criminal assets and missing persons reports, a horrifying picture emerged. Wasn't just a code name, it was the designation of a pipeline stretching from their small city into a nationwide network, and Elijah had been inches from exposing it when he was silenced. Michael leaned back, feeling bile rise in his throat, and then froze as his gaze caught a photograph wedged between the pages of Elijah's battered notebook, an image blurred by motion but unmistakable nonetheless, showing Shadow, teeth bared, ripping open the trunk of a nondescript sedan parked behind an abandoned warehouse. Michael remembered now, a fragment Elijah had once drunkenly confessed late one night at O'Malley's pub, about a bust that had gone wrong, about a damn miracle when Shadow had acted on instinct, revealing a trunk packed not with contraband but with 3 terrified, shackled teenagers who would otherwise have disappeared without a trace. That moment had been the beginning of the end for Elijah, the moment when those in power realized he was a threat too dangerous to ignore. Michael's stomach twisted harder as he flipped through more photos, Shadow sniffing out hidden compartments, Elijah documenting serial numbers, fingerprints, license plates, until he found a set of DNA analysis reports tucked between the pages, labeled with dates just days before Elijah's death. Michael's heart hammered in his chest as he read the final notation: DNA match subject, Officer Daniel Cross. Michael swore under his breath, his mind reeling. Officer Cross, a young rising star in the department, had been found dead in his apartment 2 days before Elijah's fatal accident, ruled a suicide by overdose, despite his spotless record and no known history of drug use. Cross had been clean, disciplined, an exemplar of the force, and now his DNA was tied to the spectral entity captured on film at Elijah's funeral, the faint, human-like shape that had rested a ghostly hand on Shadow's shoulder. Michael scrubbed a trembling hand down his face, struggling to process the implications. Somehow, Cross was involved whether willingly or not, and now, even in death, his presence lingered, trapped or bound by forces Michael couldn't yet understand. A heavy knock on the door made him jolt upright, his heart leaping into his throat, and Shadow immediately rose to his feet, hackles raised, teeth bared in a silent snarl pointed at the entrance. Michael reached for his sidearm, creeping toward the door, the pounding blood in his ears muffling everything else. But when he yanked the door open, the hallway was empty save for a small, battered envelope lying on the welcome mat. He snatched it up, scanning the corridor before slamming the door shut again and bolting it. Inside, the envelope contained nothing but a single Polaroid photograph, yellowed and faded, depicting Elijah standing beside Shadow, shaking hands with Chief Prescott during what looked like a routine awards ceremony. Except someone, maybe Elijah himself, had violently scratched out Prescott's face with deep, angry gouges, and in the margins, scrawled in a frantic, familiar hand, were 4 chilling words. "He knows. They know." Michael staggered back, his breath ragged, his mind spiraling. Someone had left this here tonight, knowing he was digging, knowing he was getting close. Shadow whined urgently, pacing in tight, anxious circles, his gaze flicking toward the boarded windows as if expecting something or someone to come crashing through at any moment. Michael pocketed the photograph, grabbing his satchel and stuffing it with Elijah's files, the laptop, anything that might be useful later, driven by a sudden primal certainty that he couldn't stay here, not now, not when he had stirred the hornet's nest so violently. As he slung the bag over his shoulder, the lights flickered once, twice, before cutting out completely, plunging the apartment into suffocating darkness. And in that pitch-black silence he heard it the whisper of something moving, slow and deliberate, scraping along the walls, unseen but unbearably present. And then, just beyond the boundary of vision, a faint glimmer, the shape of a man or what had once been a door, its hollow eyes burning with a recognition so cold, so full of hatred, that Michael's blood turned to ice. The storm raged overhead, thunder booming so violently it rattled the windows of Michael's battered SUV as he pulled into the cracked and overgrown driveway of the old Riverside funeral home. The building looming against the night sky like a corpse waiting to be exhumed, its blackened windows staring blindly into the void, its facade half swallowed by ivy and rot. And despite the howling wind and the hammering rain, the moment Michael stepped out, he knew the real chill in the air had nothing to do with the weather. Shadow stayed close to his side, moving with that tense, predatory precision he had exhibited back when he was an active canine, his nose low to the ground, his ears flicking nervously at every distant clap of thunder. And together they approached the warped front door, which groaned on its hinges as Michael forced it open, the rusted handle cutting a cold bite into his palm. The air inside was heavier than outside, thick with the fetid stink of mold and mildew, a dampness that clung to the skin and filled the lungs like wet cotton. And as Michael swung his flashlight in a slow arc across the ruined lobby, the beam illuminated broken chairs, shattered picture frames, and the shattered remains of once elegant chandeliers now hanging like nooses from the cracked ceiling tiles. Shadow growled low in his throat, the sound vibrating against Michael's leg, and Michael gritted his teeth, pushing forward, his boots squelching against the soaked carpet, every step feeling more and more like a descent into some unseen underworld. They moved through the darkness, down hallways that twisted and turned as if the building itself were alive and trying to lose them within its decaying entrails, until they reached the main parlor, where the remnants of Elijah's funeral had once stood, now reduced to damp ash and scattered splinters. And just as Michael lifted his flashlight to sweep across the cavernous space, a sudden loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the funeral home, followed by a low, almost human wail that rose and fell with the wind. Michael froze, heart hammering as Shadow lunged forward, his body stiff and his nose pointed toward a heavy oak door at the far end of the parlor. A door Michael was almost certain hadn't been there when he last attended Elijah's funeral. But before he could process the impossibility of that fact, the door shuddered once, twice, and then slowly creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but an impenetrable wall of blackness beyond. Michael's instincts screamed at him to leave, to run, to abandon this cursed place and never look back. But he forced himself to move forward, gripping the flashlight tighter in one hand while the other hovered near the butt of his pistol, and together he and Shadow crossed the threshold into the darkness. The temperature dropped almost instantly, the kind of sudden bone-deep cold that made breath crystallize in the air, and the beam of Michael's flashlight flickered weakly as if struggling against some unseen force. But he pressed on, his steps slow and cautious, every nerve in his body screaming at the unseen dangers lurking just beyond the edge of his vision. The hallway beyond the door sloped downward at an unnatural angle, the walls narrowing and closing in the deeper they went, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, they emerged into a wide, low-ceilinged room, the walls lined with rows of crude iron cages, some still containing the skeletal remains of things that had once been human, their bony hands stretched through the bars in eternal silent pleas for salvation. Michael staggered back, bile rising in his throat as the realization hit him this wasn't just a funeral home. It had been something else, something monstrous, a holding facility where the victims of the trafficking ring had been hidden, tortured, and ultimately silenced. Shadow whined, his tail tucked low, but he pressed himself against Michael's side, refusing to leave him even as the overwhelming stench of death and despair thickened around them like a shroud. Michael swept his flashlight over the cages, each one worse than the last, until the beam landed on something that made his blood run colder than the grave. A name scratched into the rusted metal of one of the cages, written in desperate, uneven letters. Jasmine B. Michael's knees buckled and he grabbed onto a nearby cage for support, his mind reeling. Jasmine, Elijah's sister, had been targeted, had almost been taken, and Elijah must have discovered the truth too late, must have fought to save her and been marked for death because of it. A crash from the far side of the room snapped him back to the present, and he spun around, flashlights slicing through the darkness just in time to catch a glimpse of movement, a shape tall and human-like darting behind a column. He called out, "Who's there?" But his voice sounded weak, swallowed by the oppressive gloom, and Shadow barked sharply, his teeth bared. Michael moved cautiously toward the column, every step feeling like it would be his last, and as he rounded the corner, his flashlight beam landed on a figure standing motionless against the wall. His heart stopped. It was Elijah, or rather, it looked like Elijah. The same strong jawline, the same proud stance, the same uniform, but there was something terribly wrong, something twisted. The figure's eyes glowed an unnatural, piercing blue, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque parody of a smile. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence radiated such overwhelming malice that Michael staggered back, crashing into a pile of broken furniture. The Shadow snarled, fur standing on end, but even he hesitated, clearly unsure whether to attack or flee. Michael raised his flashlight higher, his hand trembling uncontrollably, and the beam revealed more details. The uniform was stained with blood, the hands were clawed and trembling, and as the figure tilted its head in an almost curious gesture, the smell of rotting flesh filled the air. Michael's brain screamed that this couldn't be real, that it was a hallucination, a trick of grief and guilt. But deep down, he knew better. Elijah had left something unfinished, and whatever was standing before him now wasn't his friend. It was something else. Something wrong. Michael drove through the sheets of rain, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind ablaze with the image of that grotesque, twisted figure wearing Elijah's face, his heart pounding a grim beat against his ribs as he replayed every piece of evidence he had gathered, every scrap of truth Elijah had died trying to protect. And he knew there was no more time to hesitate, no more time to hide, so he made a decision that felt like stepping off the edge of a cliff. He would release everything. Every file, every photo, every hidden document that proved the rot festering at the heart of the Riverside Police Department. He would broadcast it to every news outlet, every blog, every whisper network that would listen, and let the truth burn through the lies like wildfire. He pulled into his driveway just before midnight, Shadow bounding from the passenger seat with a low, warning growl, the dog's body rigid and alert, and Michael felt the oppressive weight in the air, a charged, crackling tension that made the hair on his arms stand on end. He rushed inside, locking the door behind him, and powered up his laptop, heart hammering as he connected to a secure network, uploading files faster than he could even process what he was sending, each megabyte a nail in the coffin of the conspiracy that had claimed so many lives. But before he could finish, the front door rattled violently, then again, more insistent, and Shadow barked sharply, throwing himself against the door with enough force to make the wood shudder. Michael grabbed his pistol, moving silently toward the window, peeking out through a slit in the curtains, and his blood froze. Standing in the pouring rain was Chief Prescott himself, flanked by half a dozen officers, men and women Michael recognized. Men and women who should have been honorable but whose faces now wore expressions twisted with desperation and menace. And Michael knew with a sickening certainty that they were not here to talk. He backed away from the window just as a heavy pounding shook the door again. "Michael Hayes!" Prescott's voice boomed through the storm, loud and commanding. "Open the door, now!" Shadow snarled, planting himself firmly in front of the entrance, his body a living barricade, and Michael whispered under his breath, "Not tonight, you bastard." He moved quickly, backing toward the kitchen, scanning for any possible exits, his mind racing, but before he could act, the doorknob rattled again, and then, with a sudden splintering crack, the door burst inward, Prescott and his team surging through like a flood of locusts. Weapons drawn, Michael raised his pistol instinctively, but Shadow leapt forward with a savage bark, planting himself directly between Michael and the intruders, his fur bristling, his growl deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards. Prescott stepped forward, rain dripping from his hat, his eyes cold and pitiless, and as he opened his mouth to order the men to seize Michael, a strange thing happened. Shadow lunged not at Prescott but at the air beside him, his teeth snapping viciously at something unseen. Something that must have been there because the moment Shadow's jaws clamped shut, a loud, sharp crack echoed through the room, and the large bay window behind Prescott shattered into 1,000 glittering shards, blown outward as if struck by a massive unseen force. Chaos erupted. Officers shouted, some ducking, some drawing their weapons on reflex, and for a moment the room was a maelstrom of confusion and fear. Prescott spun around, his face pale, barking orders no one seemed able to follow. And that's when it happened. A young officer, trembling and wild-eyed, pointed a shaking finger toward the center of the room and screamed, "I see him! I see him! He's here!" Michael turned just in time to catch a glimpse of movement, a flicker in the air like heat waves off asphalt, but colder, darker, and then the young officer fired blindly into the empty space, his bullets punching holes into the drywall with deafening cracks. Prescott roared at him to hold his fire, but the damage was done, the fear had taken hold, and the group began to splinter, some backing toward the door, others spinning in circles, aiming at shadows that seemed to dart just out of. Shadow barked again, sharp and furious, and Michael could see it now, could feel it, the thing in the room with them, the wrongness pressing down on their chests, squeezing the breath from their lungs, and he realized with brutal clarity that it wasn't just Elijah's spirit that haunted them. It was something older, something vengeful, something drawn to the stench of betrayal and blood. Prescott tried to regain control, shouting commands, threatening consequences, but his voice was lost in the cacophony of gunfire, shattering glass, and the unholy screech of nails dragging across unseen surfaces. Michael ducked behind the kitchen island, gripping his pistol with white-knuckled hands, watching as Prescott turned on his own men, shoving them aside, desperate to get to Michael, desperate to silence the last living thread of truth. And Michael knew this was it. This was the moment everything would either break wide open or be buried forever. A sudden gust of icy wind roared through the broken window, carrying with it a whispering chorus of voices, indistinct but undeniably human, pleading, accusing, condemning. Shadow lunged again, this time sending one of the officers sprawling backward into a coffee table that collapsed under his weight with a splintering crash. Michael rose to his feet, heart hammering, and locked eyes with Prescott across the room. The chief's face twisted into a mask of rage and fear as the lights flickered, then died, plunging the room into utter darkness. And in that blackness, Michael heard the chief scream, a raw, radical, terrified sound that ended abruptly, swallowed by the night. The aftermath of that chaotic night unfolded faster than Michael could have anticipated. A whirlwind of leaked evidence, frantic phone calls, and frantic denials from the very men and women who had once worn the badge with supposed honor. And it was Michael himself who uploaded the final package to every major news outlet, social media platform, and whistleblower site he could find, ensuring that the truth Elijah had died for would never again be hidden behind locked doors and false reports. The video footage was damning, grainy images from hidden cameras, showing clandestine meetings between Chief Prescott and known traffickers, the transfer of money, the handoffs of terrified victims bundled into the backs of unmarked vans. The internal documents were worse, outlining a systematic effort to protect the ring and silence dissenters like Elijah, complete with forged autopsy reports, manipulated crime scenes, and falsified statements. And then there was the audio file, the final nail in the coffin, a recorded conversation between Prescott and his inner circle, captured during a drunken celebration, where they laughed about how easy it had been to make Elijah disappear. Within 24 hours, an emergency review board convened under intense public pressure, and Prescott, ever the consummate actor, put on a brave face, attending the hastily organized ceremony at City Hall, where he was to receive the Medal of Valor for his lifetime of service. A final sick irony that turned the stomachs of everyone who still remembered what the badge was supposed to mean. Michael watched from the shadows at the back of the room, Shadow sitting obediently by his side, both of them bristling with tension as the ceremony unfolded with a surreal slowness. The speeches, the handshakes, the flash of cameras, all feeling like a funeral dirge for a city soul. And then, just as Prescott stepped forward to receive the medal, the double doors at the rear of the chamber slammed open with a thunderous bang, and a squad of federal agents stormed into the room, weapons drawn, badges flashing, and in that instant, the fragile illusion of Prescott's innocence shattered like glass. Murmurs rose from the crowd, swelling into gasps and shouts as Prescott was surrounded, the agent in charge reading off a litany of charges so staggering it seemed impossible that one man could embody so much corruption. But Prescott didn't resist at first. He simply stood there, his face drained of color, his hands trembling slightly as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. Michael pushed forward through the crowd, unable to stop himself, needing to see it, needing to bear witness, and as he came within a few feet of the disgraced chief, he saw it happen. Prescott's head jerked up sharply, his eyes going wide with terror, not at the agents or the crowd, but at something else, something only he could see. His mouth worked soundlessly, and then, in a voice choked with horror, he gasped, "No, no, you're dead." Michael followed Prescott's gaze, his heart hammering in his chest, and for a split second he saw him too, Elijah, standing tall and proud at the edge of the stage, his uniform pristine, his badge gleaming, his dark eyes locked onto Prescott with a look of righteous fury so intense it seemed to burn through the very fabric of reality. Elijah said nothing, made no move, but his presence alone was enough to reduce Prescott to a trembling wreck. The once feared chief sinking to his knees, sobbing and begging for forgiveness no one would grant. Cameras flashed wildly, reporters shouted questions, the entire room descending into chaos. But Michael saw only Elijah, standing silent vigil over the moment justice finally began to claw its way out from under the mountain of lies. Shadow whined softly, pressing against Michael's leg, and Michael dropped a hand to the dog's head, grounding himself in the reality of the moment, in the knowledge that while the fight was far from over, the tide had finally turned. Federal agents dragged Prescott to his feet, hauling him toward the waiting transport van outside. And as they passed by Michael, Prescott's eyes flickered to him, filled with a hatred so raw it was almost pitiable. But Michael stared back without flinching, without fear, because he knew now that Elijah's spirit was not a thing to be feared but a beacon, a rallying cry for those who refused to be cowed by darkness. Outside, the rain had stopped, the night eerily still as the transport van's engine growled to life, carrying Prescott away to face the consequences of his sins. And for a long moment, Michael stood there in the center of the ruined ceremony, the pieces of a broken city scattered around him like ashes, wondering what would come next, what new battles would have to be fought to ensure the sacrifices made were not in vain. He felt a presence at his side, warm and solid, and looked down to see Shadow gazing up at him, eyes bright with a fierce, unspoken loyalty that brought a lump to Michael's throat. "We're not done yet, buddy," he murmured, ruffling the dog's fur, and as he turned to leave the hall behind, to step into whatever uncertain future awaited, he caught one last glimpse of Elijah's ghostly figure, watching from the shadows, a faint smile playing across his lips before he faded into the night. The winter had come in full force, blanketing the city in a thick layer of white that muffled every sound and turned even the most familiar streets into unfamiliar frozen landscapes. Michael pulled his coat tighter around him as he trudged up the slope of Greenwood Cemetery, his boots crunching softly in the freshly fallen snow. Jasmine walked beside him, her face pale but determined, while behind them, Elijah's mother and a few close friends followed silently, each step heavy with memory and loss. Shadow led the way, the once proud German shepherd now moving slower, his frame gaunt with age, his muzzle almost entirely gray, yet his spirit remained unbowed, his head held high as he forged a path through the snow toward the ancient oak tree that loomed near the northern edge of the cemetery. They reached the tree just as the clouds parted to reveal a full moon, its silver light washing the world in a soft, ethereal glow. Shadow stopped at the base of the tree, pawing at the frozen ground, his breaths coming in visible puffs. Michael knelt beside him, brushing away the snow to reveal a small, rusted tin box buried beneath the roots. Inside, carefully preserved against time and decay, were the last pieces of Elijah's work. Additional documents, names, locations, evidence that ensured no one involved in the trafficking ring would ever escape justice again. Michael handed the box to Jasmine, who clutched it to her chest as tears slid silently down her cheeks. No one spoke. Words felt unnecessary here, where the very air seemed to hum with Elijah's lingering presence, a silent testament to the life he had given for the truth. Shadow stood still for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the moonlight, and then, slowly, he lifted his muzzle to the sky. A long, mournful howl tore from his throat, rising into the night like a lament for all that had been lost and a final salute to the man who had been his partner, his protector, his family. The sound carried far across the frozen cemetery, weaving through the tombstones, climbing the barren trees and settling deep into the hearts of those who heard it. Michael felt his own throat tighten painfully, his eyes burning with unshed tears. It was not merely grief he felt, but something deeper, something that transcended death, the enduring bond between two souls who had trusted each other beyond all else. The group stood there motionless, until Shadow's howl faded into the stillness of the night, leaving behind only the whisper of the wind and the faint rustle of falling snow. They returned to their cars in silence, the night pressing close around them, but Michael lingered, unable to tear himself away. He watched as Shadow circled once at the base of the oak tree, then lay down carefully beside Elijah's gravestone, resting his head against the cold marble as if he had finally found his way home. Michael approached slowly, crouching beside the old dog, laying a hand gently on his side. "You did good, boy," he whispered, his voice cracking. "He kept your promise." Shadow's body rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, his breathing deep and steady, but there was a stillness about him, a serenity that Michael had not seen before. He stayed there for a long time, until the cold seeped into his bones and the stars began to fade from the sky. When he finally rose and walked away, he looked back once, seeing the dark shape of Shadow curled against the headstone, a silent sentinel keeping his final watch. The dawn broke pale and cold, casting a weak golden light over the snow-blanketed cemetery. When Michael returned with Jasmine and Elijah's mother, they found Shadow still there, but he was no longer breathing. He lay with his eyes closed, a faint, peaceful smile on his grizzled muzzle, his body already dusted with a thin layer of snow as if the earth itself had begun to reclaim him. Jasmine fell to her knees, sobbing quietly, and Michael felt his heart shatter anew. Shadow had stayed until the end, guarding the man he had loved beyond life itself, and when his task was finally complete, he had let go with the same quiet dignity that had defined him in life. In the weeks that followed, the city, still reeling from the exposure of Prescott's crimes, came together to honor the true heroes of their story. At the heart of the city's largest park, a monument was erected, a bronze statue of Elijah in uniform, standing tall and proud, his hand resting on the head of a German shepherd seated loyally at his side. Beneath the statue, a simple plaque read, "In honor of those who served without fear, without favor, and without forgetting. Elijah Brooks and Shadow Guardians of the Truth." The dedication ceremony drew hundreds, maybe thousands, people who had never known Elijah personally, but who now understood the depth of his sacrifice. Michael stood among them, his heart heavy but proud, feeling the presence of both Elijah and Shadow in the crisp winter air. knowing that while their physical forms were gone, their spirit, their bond, their unwavering pursuit of justice would live on in every person who dared to stand against the darkness. As the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, Michael raised his eyes to the statue, a small, bittersweet smile tugging at his lips, and whispered, "Rest easy, my friends, you're home." If this story touched you even half as much as it touched me writing it, I would be honored if you could like and subscribe to stay connected. I truly want to hear from you. Which moment moved you the most? Was it the final scene under the oak tree, or the night when shadow faced? And where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments. Your thoughts mean more than you think.